called Jewish labor. So even when there were when these a lot of these kibbutzim were set up, and there were, of course, not a small number of Palestinian residents in the land, and these Palestinian residents were used to doing a lot of physical labor for the absentee landlords who lived in Turkey and other parts of the Middle East. But the labor Zionists were ideologically opposed to employing Palestinians to work on their collective farms, because they felt that would undermine the process of Jewish people establishing this intimate relationship with the land through farming. So Jewish labor was one of the, you have to farm your own land. Another impact that labor Zionism has had on Israel was they set up very powerful national unions. There's an organization called the Histadrut, which is like a national union that really advocated for some important, really very strong worker protections in the country, way beyond what was existing in the United States at the time, and probably beyond anything that came to exist in the United States. I mean, the Histadrut was one of the most powerful organizations in Israel for decades. They also organized a national health insurance, Kupat Cholim, that provided health insurance to everybody. Today, there are 3 national health insurance organizations in Israel. One of the reasons that people are saying that Israel was so effective about distributing the vaccine is because everybody belongs to one of these 3 national health organizations. So once they get the vaccines to the national health organizations, they could run with the ball and start vaccinating people who were members. And, we don't really have anything like that in this country. So we're much less efficient in that way. So big impact that labor Zionism had on the first couple of generations. Now, that impact has significantly lessened over the last 30, 40 years. One way you see that is that the Labor Party in elections used to be consistently the dominant party. They were, I don't know, maybe at some point they were the absolute majority, but they always got a plurality of the votes. And that changed for the first time in 1977. When Menachem Begin became the prime minister, and today, I know the elections. How many? We're going on election number 4 in like a period of 18 months or something. Pretty soon, Labor may not even get into the government. They may not even get the cross the threshold of the minimum of like enough votes to get them 3 or 4 mandates. So they may actually not be in the government after this coming election. So that's a radical shift for this party. Okay. Now, to balance out the labor Zionists, we had the revisionist Zionists led by Ze'ev Jabotinsky. And so the revisionists said that they weren't into kind of compromise and negotiation. They were pretty hard-nosed. Like with the British, who held the mandate to Palestine, they wanted to put serious political pressure, and in some cases military pressure, on the British government to accede to the demands that they were making. They didn't want to compromise on their demands, and they wanted to maximize the size of the state of Israel. They wanted to maximize the number of Jewish people who could come and live in the future state of Israel. And so this group became eventually they became the right wing of political Zionism. The labor Zionists became the left wing of political Zionism. So for a long time, it was the revisionist versus labor. That was like the main political dynamic in Israel for several decades after the founding of the state. All right. I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any comments or questions before we go any further with Kaplan. Lila?
Just so I can remember this, what the they were called the revisionists because they revising something? They were
Yeah,
remaking.
that's a very good question and a good point.
Just
I am gonna. I feel like I want to punt on that one, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that I think maybe what they were revising, and someone could look this up. You know, I think they were maybe revising kind of Herzl's basic approach, which was one that involved negotiating, getting European political leaders on board with something, and um, not like flexing your muscles. Like that wasn't Herzl's MO. And Jabotinsky was all about flexing Jewish muscles. That was like a big. I don't know if he used that expression explicitly, but he wanted very much to inhabit that approach. But I'm not gonna commit to that as the answer to your question. But hopefully maybe someone can find out and share that. Anybody else before we go on to Kaplan and Reconstructionism? Okay. All right. So, so we've talked, it's been a little while, but we did talk a little bit about Kaplan's life and his civilizational model, that he wanted his definition of Judaism to be all-encompassing, and it was, and that all-encompassing dimension potentially included a national dimension. Not only a national dimension, but certainly a national dimension could fit in. So he welcomed, Kaplan was an early American proponent of Zionism long before a lot of other American Jews, and in this day and age, it's hard to remember this, but around the world, Zionism was a significant minority among Jews for different reasons. Most Jews in the West were not super excited about Zionism because it felt like it was a dangerous, and we talked about how Zionism was kind of in tension with the way that Western Jews had accommodated to life in the modern world. They became, citizens of the country they lived in, of the Mosaic persuasion. So the existence of a Jewish state complicated they felt like it complicated their status as citizens of a particular nation state. American Jews felt that way, German Jews, French Jews. And so a lot of Jews were not super excited. A lot of liberal Jews were not super excited about the Zionist initiative. A lot of Orthodox Jews were not excited about the Zionist initiative because they felt it wasn't the place of, they felt like it was like pushing the hand of God towards the Messiah, like going back to the land. And they didn't feel it was appropriate. They thought it was chutzpahdik for Jews to think about reestablishing a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state before God had made it happen. So most of the Orthodox Jews were not that excited about Zionism. So it was a minority. I can't give you a percentage, but it was a minority of the global Jewish community. And but Kaplan was part of the minority that said, no, this is going to be a good thing for the global Jewish community because in a place where Jews are either a majority or a very significant minority, the kind of cultural and spiritual development that's going to be possible in that context is going to be very different from what's possible where Jews live as small minorities in other countries. So he saw that there was a unique possibility for the development of Jewish culture initially in Palestine and then in Israel. However, one of the things that made him unique among all Zionists, I guess this was somewhat still part of this was even in the spiritual cultural context, because the way Achad Ha'am described the flow of culture was that it would be developed in Palestine or Israel, and it would flow out to, it was like it was like a hub and spokes. And Israel and Palestine, they were the hub, and the spokes were all the other Jewish communities around the world. And the cultural developments, the spiritual nourishment would flow to the Jewish communities around the world. But Kaplan said, even though there is this unique robustness to living as a significant minority or majority in a place, that doesn't mean that the diaspora communities also don't have unique developments that are going on that even Jews living in the Middle East, in Palestine and in Israel, could benefit from. So really Kaplan, as I think probably a lot of us remember, he was a great lover of democracy, of American democracy, and of American culture. And so he felt that the Judaism developing in America would actually have things to offer to the Judaism developing in, pre-state Palestine and Israel as well. And no one else was saying that at the time. That was an absolutely unique kind of Zionist vision, that you could both support, you could be a diaspora Zionist, you could be a proud diaspora Zionist and believe that your diaspora community had something to offer Israel, just as Israel had something to offer the diaspora. So that was a unique contribution of Kaplan's. One of the core ideas of political Zionism was this notion of the negation. They called it the negation of exile, shlilat hagolah. Basically, that everything that happened in Jewish culture between the time of the destruction of the first temple and the time of the return to Palestine in the late 19th century, none of that had any value from the perspective of many of these political Zionists. So, that's why the Yiddish language was absolutely denigrated by early Zionists, because it was a product of what they called this kind of weak diaspora Jewish culture. And Jewish culture in the diaspora was all about your head and nothing about your body. And in Israel, again, we talked about how there's this emphasis on physicality, the physicality of the land, but also the physicality of the people. That the physical strength would once again be a quality that Jews would aspire to, whereas in the diaspora they said, Jews, because they had no other choice, because they weren't allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to farm, they were only allowed to engage in intellectual pursuits. They had no choice but to kind of downplay the whole role of physicality. But so anyway, they rejected the political Zionists rejected anything that came out of the diaspora, but that was never Kaplan's way, because he had this notion of evolution, right? And he saw that every phase, every stage of evolution produced things of value and richness. And so whether or not it happened, the whole Talmud, well, there was a Palestinian Talmud, but the main Talmud that was used for, millennia, it was produced in the diaspora. It was produced in the Babylonian diaspora. So, a lot of early Zionists thought rabbinic Judaism in general was just not worth very much. What really counted is you wanted to go back to the Torah, because the Torah was a text that was developed in the land of Israel, and therefore it had roots, it had cultural roots that were, in the land, and it had value. And to this day, even secular Israeli students, I know many of us know this, you have to study Hebrew Bible as a regular required course all the way through school. You have to study Hebrew Bible because there's an expectation that you're going to have a relationship with that text. But there is no expectation that you're going to have a relationship with any other period of Jewish literature, perhaps up until modern Israel. And then of course, you're going to study the poets and the philosophers in the Zionist context, but you're not going to study the rabbis. You're not going to study the medieval philosophers. I'm sure you can. I'm sure there are opportunities, maybe now especially. I think there's been some evolution in that that arena within Israel. But for a long time, it was Hebrew Bible, and that was the be all and end all of Jewish source texts. Okay. Say one more thing about cultural and spiritual Zionism and Kaplan's connection to it. In that one school of thought, the idea of a Jewish state was not seen as the ultimate goal of the project. The ultimate goal was this cultural renaissance, and the state, the existence of a state, could potentially support this process, but it was not seen as being absolutely necessary to that process. And there were people in this school of cultural Zionism who were among a minority of Zionists who early on, before the state of Israel was created, who were already arguing at that point for a binational state, because they felt that that would be the healthiest way to deal with the potential clash of cultures that they saw coming between Jewish immigrants and the Palestinian people who lived there and who were used to working for these absentee landlords who lived like in the Ottoman Empire. All right, let's see. So there, I would say that so these labor Zionists who really were in charge of the beginning part of the state, they really had a vision, again, kind of based on socialism, of justice and equal treatment. And if anyone has ever read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, it's a very idealistic document. It's kind of amazing. I mean, I guess we could have the same experience by reading our own Declaration of Independence. But we do that more frequently probably. But so there is this vision, almost a utopian, almost a secular messianic vision of the role that Israel could play in the world and the kind of life that Jews would be able to lead there. And it was very, it was a document that recognized the value of all peoples and all groups. And so as we know, history and human foibles are often not very kind to idealistic visions that people have. And so over time, the vision enshrined in the Israeli Declaration of Independence really, seemed like it was receding into the background and became harder and harder to kind of stay directly connected with. There were lots of wars that took place. The Arab countries surrounding Israel from the beginning did not accept the existence of Israel. And, from their perspective, there was no reason they should. From, Jews' perspective, it was something that we thought the world, especially because remember, the state of Israel was created after the Holocaust. So it was the world was really just coming to grips with what Nazi Germany had tried to do. I mean, had done and even, and had wanted to do. If they had been able to, they would have, destroyed the entire global Jewish people. So, so the Jewish community, and what happened after World War II, I'll just circle back to this. Almost the entire Jewish world became Zionist after World War II because people understood what had happened and what even, how much worse it even could. It was terrible. It was awful. And it could have been even more destructive, as hard as that is to believe. And so the necessity that a lot of Jews around the world felt about having a Jewish state, a place where Jews could go to in the event of being threatened in the way that the Nazis or other groups might threaten them, it all of a sudden was an absolute clarity, like, of course, we need a state. And so all of the Jewish groups that earlier had not been as enthusiastic became really solid supporters of the idea of a state, of a Jewish state. Okay. So there's been, anyway, there were wars, a number of wars. Some of them are very famous. The 6-Day War in 1967 that really fundamentally created the dynamics that are still being grappled with, because it appeared initially that Israel was going to get crushed in this war, because all of the, it was the combined armies of like five or six Arab countries. And the Israeli Air Force ended up deciding to make a preemptive strike on the Egyptian Air Force. And had they not done that, Israel probably would have been overrun. And because they did do that, they were able to control their own destinies militarily, and the war was over in 6 days. And to a lot of people who had any kind of religious bent whatsoever, it felt almost miraculous that this little country that didn't have anywhere near the firepower of the combined, didn't have the populations anywhere near, didn't have the, military capability, but they won this war solidly. And they took over. They were able to claim the old city of Jerusalem, or the part of the old city of Jerusalem that had been occupied by Jordan since the creation of the state in 48. And so you see all these famous pictures of, soldiers running up to the Western Wall and kissing it. Like it was these soldiers were not religious even necessarily. There was something very culturally powerful about having access to this place that had such ancient resonance with Jewish people. And of course, the territories that had been controlled by Jordan, that where a lot of Palestinians lived and continue to live, which are known by various names today, occupied territories. Some people call them Judea and Samaria, but these are the territories. Actually, ironically, if you're talking about biblical texts, these are the territories where a lot of the Jewish action from the Bible takes place, in Judea and Samaria and the occupied territories. Excuse me. But that was supposed to be the future Palestinian state, right? And the place where most of the Jews live is not as much, it's discussed in the Bible, but doesn't have the famous Jewish locations that the Hebrew Bible talks about. So Israel took over that territory, and then that has been at issue since 1967. And to this day, right? I mean, this, as recently as last summer, there's been this, the Trump peace plan, quote unquote, which was set up to allow Israel to take over a significant chunk of that land and incorporate it into the state. And that had never, that was always supposed to be something that was, going to be negotiated between the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian leaders. And there were many attempts, which I'm sure all of us are aware of, under President Clinton and under President Obama, and it never bore the kind of fruit that people had hoped it would. All right, I'm getting to the modern Reconstructionist movement here. After 1967, Lila?
I just wondered whether it changed whether the Holocaust changed the way that Mordecai Kaplan talked and wrote about. Was he subject to the same fervor of statehood that the rest of the Jewish world was.
That's an excellent
I
question.
don't know.
Yeah. I don't know, but I do have volume 3 of his diaries, and so I would like to see if I can find out. Um, he remained. He was a very progressive political person throughout his entire life, and it's interesting because I know he actually, right, he made Aliyah in like um 19, maybe the late 60s or early 70s, when he was 80 something, and he lived almost the last 20 years of his life in Israel. And I can't imagine that he did not weigh in. And so he was there right after the 6 Day War, and that's really when things got a lot more complicated. Not to say they weren't complicated before, but they got a lot more complicated after the 6 Day War. And one of the things that happened is that we talked about this religious response that some people have, like the fact that Israel won this war, to some people felt like this is like the divine hand at work. It could not have happened without God's help. There was this whole sector, even people who were not formally Orthodox. I think there's something very compelling. It was a quote unquote a David and Goliath story, similar to what happened in the War for Independence, and so it strengthened in Israel and around the world in certain sectors of Jewish society this kind of neo-messianic view of things, that Israel did represent. It was part of this early religious Zionist view that coming back to the land, this small minority of Orthodox Jews who said, no, we can go back to the land because this is the beginning of the redemptive process. And the fact that it's even being put on the table as an option by these secular authorities is a sign from God that we should go live in the land. So from the beginning of pre-state Palestine, there were always some Orthodox Jews who were drawn to living in Israel. But after the 6 Day War, this kind of neo-messianic sense of, God is really, putting pedal to the metal here, and we're moving forward towards Redemption Day. And so the forces in Israel became very, much, much more powerful. And it's probably not coincidental that it was less than 10 years after, or was about 10 years after the 6 Day War, that the Labor Party lost its first election. And there had been this increase in sentiment of this messianic orientation. And so the other thing I just wanted to say, and I'm sorry I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I talked about wars complicating Israel's idealism. We talked about there was Jewish immigration from all these different places that was complicated, that didn't always go so well, especially Jews from some Middle Eastern countries like Yemen and North Africa, who were not treated always so well by the Ashkenazic, quote unquote, sophisticated Western European or Eastern European Jews, who saw Middle Eastern Jews as being backward and, unsophisticated. And so these Middle Eastern Jews were absorbed into Israel, but they were really second-class citizens for a long time. And there was a kind of, I don't know if racism is the right word. There was bigotry of, felt by the Ashkenazic Jews towards the Middle Eastern Jews. And it's only, I don't think it's relatively recently that has started to shift, maybe within the last generation, but it still exists. It's not totally eradicated, but it's better than it used to be. And then we have the Ethiopian immigration, and that is still a big issue in Israel, because a lot of Ethiopian Jews are not seen as being fully Jewish in the same way, even by Middle Eastern Jews. There is this, continuing pecking order among Israeli citizens. And then there was this huge influx of Russian immigrants, and there was, question of were, were they Jewish, or what does it mean that they, call themselves Jewish? Some of them did, some of them didn't. So very complicated processes of absorbing immigrants. And then, of course, there was a substantial Palestinian minority within Israel proper, let alone the Palestinians that live in the occupied territories that the Israeli military has been in charge of. That there are, 20%, 15-20% of Israel's citizenry are Palestinians. And so that, it's an amazingly complex situation. And so it, lots of things happened that were unfortunate and difficult and caused pain and caused anger. And this pain and anger continues to exist in many different sectors of Israeli society. You may have been, I'm sure some of us are following the fact that there have been all these demonstrations against the current Prime Minister Netanyahu all over the country, not just all over the country, all over the world. Israeli communities around the world, including some in the United States, have been maintaining these weekly demonstrations for an incredible amount of time. So it's a very it's no less a challenging place than the United States is. Let me say it that way. There could be a good contest between the two countries to see where it's more challenging to make things work well. Okay. Back to the national messianism. There was this real push to settle, for Jews to settle in the occupied territories and start these new developments, many of which were not, there's, in the international community, it was clear. And even within Israel, there were a lot of people who thought that this shouldn't be happening. But the governments in Israel have tended to support the development of these settlements because the final status of the territories had never been negotiated. In the meantime, there were all these religious Jews who were settling in the territories. And in some cases, the government was making it very attractive to settle there because they were saying, well, if you move to this settlement, you don't have to pay taxes for 10 years, or the land is very cheap, or it made it very attractive for people to move there, in addition to the fact that we're ideologically drawn to living there. And it created this situation where there was a sector of Israeli society who believed that Israel was just marching along this road to the final kind of messianic event that was described by the prophets. And they saw that anything that happened that impeded that process, or that in their eyes kind of backtracked from that process, was like sinful, because it was a failure to cooperate with the divine process of moving Israel towards redemption. So, the most tragic outcome of this was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who had decided, a former, great military leader, someone who had all kinds of bona fides in terms of, no one was going to ever accuse him, although people probably did anyway, of, being, weak on security. That was just, it would be a difficult argument to make. But he had come to the conclusion, right, that the future of Israel was dependent on settling this issue with the Palestinians, and that having two states was the way to go. And he got on board with the Oslo process. And in the right-wing messianic infused community in Israel, there was explicit talk about taking his life. For a long time before Yigal Amir assassinated him, people were talking about he needed to be taken out because he was leading the Jewish people down a path of, terrible, rejection of God's will. And so, in fact, this young yeshiva student ended up taking it upon himself, I'm sure with the encouragement of many people in his community, to go and assassinate Rabin. And, you know, I don't think anyone debates the fact that that did absolutely change the course of Israel's destiny from then on. So certainly in the short and medium term, you know, hopefully, who knows what's going to, I mean, you know, but he, I think Rabin had a very clear commitment to achieving a two-state process. And I think there was a certain amount of respect that he had, you know, in the Arab world and in the Palestinian world, and no one after him had that same status. And this was probably something that he was uniquely positioned to work for, and he was, you know, he was assassinated. So, and it was that ideology that fueled the assassination, and we're certainly now familiar with that, unfortunately, in the United States, right? We see that happening right now among some, you know, extremist populations in our country who have been, you know, we saw it happen on January 6th, unfortunately, right? And that's still very much alive and well in this country. Okay. I'm going to say a currently shrinking segment of the Israeli population retains the kind of original ethical and spiritual orientation that we see in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. There are still people that very much represent that, but it does seem to be at the moment, a shrinking percentage of the Israeli society, which is very challenging. And at the same time, that shrinking percentage is also the group that really identifies with Western democracy and Western liberalism, and is loath to take stands or take actions that are fly in the face of those values. But the current administration has no problem with doing that. I think, you know, the Netanyahu administration has no problem with taking steps that fly in the face of Western liberalism. All right. All right. I'm going to talk finally about modern Reconstructionism in the context of all this stuff. Thank you for your patience as we wade through all of the backdrop. So the modern Reconstructionist movement tends to identify, in general, with this shrinking segment of the Israeli population that sees itself as part of the Western liberal tradition, that sees itself as part of the democratic tradition, and that wants to really maintain Israel as a democratic state and sees the value and the importance, whether that is focused on the value and importance for Israel proper and or also for the Palestinians, of having a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And I would say that the center of gravity of our movement, and the movement kind of in its official stance, very much represents that perspective. And however, within our movement across the country and within different congregations and communities, I would say that we have more this is certainly true in Kol Halev, and I think it's true of the Reconstructionist movement overall. We have more political diversity around this issue than around any other issue that I can think of. Our membership definitely skews progressive on domestic politics. There is no, you know, there's no doubt about that. Not saying that there aren't, you know, more conservative members. I think there probably are, but the center of gravity is very much to the left on domestic issues. But when it comes to talking about Israel and the Middle East, there is a wide range of perspectives within our movement. We have members who are advocates of Israel becoming a binational state, where it would no longer be just a Jewish state, but it would be a binational state. On the left, I'm sure we have members who support the continuation of building new settlements in the occupied territories, Judea and Samaria, on the right, and perhaps, bringing that land into, annexing that into Israel proper. We have people who, identify with that perspective, and then everything in the middle. So I would say that our movement in some ways has a more complex relationship with this reality than any other Jewish movement in the United States, because I think we are the most diverse, for better or for worse, when it comes to this, than the Reform movement. It's certainly the case of the Reform movement, the conservative movement. We just have more diversity on this issue. I would say that in our movement, again, not everybody identifies with this, but I would say the center of gravity is that there has been a traditional notion that if you're not living in Israel, if you're not an Israeli citizen, you don't have a right to speak about what Israel does. I would say in the Reconstructionist movement, that is not the position that we take. And again, individuals might differ on this, but in general, the movement is one that believes in the importance of diaspora Jews speaking out, and supporting the forces in Israel that represent the values that we as individuals or as an organization or as a movement aspire to. So that's an important. I would say that our movement is less anxious about taking public stands on issues in Israel than other movements are, including the Reform movement, which in general is a very social justice oriented movement. When it comes to Israel, I think they're a little more reticent about taking public stands than the Reconstructionist movement. This issue is so complex for us that we've had for a while, and I imagine we'll continue to have. We have this Israel Commission. You may have read about it. I put something in my Friday emails for several weeks in a row because they were looking for people from the movement to be involved. But basically, this Israel Commission is a group of rabbis and lay leaders from the Reconstructionist movement who represent a wide range of perspectives, who are getting together to try to create a microcosm of what it would look like for people with very different perspectives on Israel and Palestine to be able to talk to each other in a civil and generative way, rather than a way that doesn't lead to anything good happening. Let's see. So, there are all these different Israel advocacy organizations in the United States. On the right, there's lots and lots. I can't even, there's probably 30 of them. I don't know, but on the right, kind of the quintessential right-wing Israel advocacy group is the Zionist Organization of America. They are like the revisionists in the Israeli context. And then, we have groups that identify more as centrist, like AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee, where they, I think, for the most part, see it as their job to help generate positive relationships between American politicians and American citizenry and Israel. And they don't discriminate very much in terms of which Israeli government happens to be in power. It's like they see it as their job to create positive relationships between America and Israel, and to stand up if they think that Israel is being unfairly attacked. So that's the centrist group. Then we have J Street, which is a newer organization, which is an Israel advocacy group that believes very strongly in the importance of there being a two-state solution, which of course has receded more and more ever since Rabin's assassination. And at this point, there are lots of people that even doubt that it's possible anymore. But there are still people who very much believe that that's the only way to go. And so J Street supports the notion of Israel as a Jewish state, And they also very much advocate for the bringing into being of a Palestinian state side by side in the way that Rabin did 30 years ago, and or 25 years ago. And they also believe that it's important because the American government has power and leverage, that their role as an American Jewish advocacy group is to influence the United States government to take steps that will maximize the likelihood that Israel and the Palestinians will go back into negotiations and come out with a two-state agreement. And even if the Israeli government is not amenable to that vision. So this puts J Street in a slightly different category, because they're willing to apply pressure through the US government to the Israeli government if they feel the Israeli government is not authentically interested in a two-state solution, because this group has a strong sense that that is the best way, and probably in some cases, in some people's minds, the only way that there will be a sustainable state of Israel, 50 years from now or 100 years from now. So that's J Street. And then further to the left, we have groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace. Those are not identical groups. If Not Now is a group that their main thing is the occupation needs to end, and we're going to do everything we can to end the occupation, and that's really our main goal. And what happens after that, we're not making any statements about, but we've got to get the occupation out of Judea and Samaria, or out of the occupied territories. And then JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, I'm not as familiar with their perspectives, but I think they're one of the groups that really says that Israel should be a binational, that Israel should not be an exclusively Jewish state anymore, and it should be a binational state. And these are issues that generate a lot of heat, sometimes light, but mostly heat, I think, when people talk about them. And many of us know that we've made different attempts over the years to have conversations within Kohalev, where we are a microcosm, I would say, of the national movement in this way, where we have a very wide range of perspectives. Okay. I think that's all I have to say about at this moment. About do people have questions or comments, or something that you'd like to? All right, Audrey.
So I don't know if I missed this, because you sure covered a lot of ground. So where exactly does the conservative movement stand with Israel? Solidly, I mean, you have all these factions in Israel. So that's one question. Two, I'm a convert, so I've always felt this strange, like, limbo feeling about Israel, because technically I'm not, that changes my position, my connection to them. So anyway.
Can I just to clarify, Audrey, I want to make sure, when you started that sentence, technically I'm not, I want to make sure you weren't going to say, like, if you decided to make Aliyah, that you wouldn't be allowed to, because you would be allowed to, right? As someone who's chosen Judaism as an adult, the state of Israel would allow, yeah.
They would?
At this point, they would. I'm not saying that isn't going to change at some point, because
So when did that change, or has that been the position?
Well, so it has been. This is a weird thing. So the state has always had a broad definition of who qualifies to become an Israeli citizen as a Jew, and they started right with Hitler's definition of Judaism, which was having one Jewish grandparent. And but that included people who chose Judaism as adults who lived in the diaspora. So, so since the founding of the state, my understanding is that people who choose Judaism as adults can make Aliyah, but once you become an Israeli citizen, you are then subject to the chief rabbinate. And the chief rabbinate has much stricter definitions of who is a Jew. So, and who is a rabbi. So if you made Aliyah, and if you, any kind of life cycle thing that you would have, you'd have to deal with some challenges. So you couldn't get married in Israel by a rabbi and have it recognized by the state because I'm assuming that, you know, you would have had to have, if you had gone through and maybe you did, if the rabbi who officiated at your conversion was a recognized Orthodox authority, it's
Right.
possible that your conversion would be recognized. But
So originally I went for an Orthodox conversion. It did not happen. And then I went for a conservative conversion. And, you know, I mean, that was the Orthodox position. If you ever want to go to Israel, you'll be acknowledged as being Jewish. So it's interesting that you discussed all the different levels of what goes on in Israel. So I hear what you're saying, at least. And I think you probably would get different answers from different people. I'm not going to move to Israel, so it's not an issue.
Okay. Okay.
But I mean, so I hope to have you also answer the thing about conservative Judaism. But the other thing is I am by and large a pacifist, not 100%, but let's say 90%. So I have a very hard time with the intensity of war and everything that goes on in Israel. I mean, it's just, and the fact that so many Jews, their brain just doesn't, it just stops working. I mean, a lot of people can't have a rational conversation, which, you know, I just not interested in a conversation where people are so emotional that they can't really, you know, talk. So anyway, the history of Israel is very complicated and difficult, and anyway, so conservative Judaism obviously is very pro-Israel. I mean, my kids went to Schechter, and for 8 years they heard nothing but going to Israel and the connection to Israel.
So sorry, I would distinguish between institutional conservatism and individual conservative Jews.
Okay.
And I would think even in the institutional context, there's going to be some range. I know that there are conservative rabbis that belong to J Street. Oh, I didn't tell you this. The vast majority of Reconstructionist rabbis are members of J Street. So that is the center of gravity of the rabbinic community in the Reconstructionist world. There are rabbis who belong to other organizations to the left and to the right of J Street, but J Street is by far, I would say, maybe 55 or 60% of Reconstructionist rabbis belong to J Street. So that's the center of gravity. And there are conservative rabbis who belong to J Street and probably to organizations, you know, to the left, not in the same numbers or percentages that Reconstructionist rabbis do. But there's going to be a range in every movement. But I do think, like, the Reconstructionist movement, our center of gravity is in a different place than the conservative movement center of gravity. You know, like, we belong, there's a collection of organizations called, something like the Progressive Israel Network or something like that. I'm not getting the name quite right. But the Reconstructionist movement belongs to this Progressive Israel Network, and I don't think the Reform movement does, and I don't think the conservative movement does. So this is a group of organizations that are willing to publicly call out the Israeli government in certain contexts that a lot of other Jewish organizations in this country aren't willing to do.
So I know I've taken up a lot of time. I do have one other question.
Go ahead.
So my daughter-in-law was born in Lebanon.
Yeah.
So needless to say, this makes life a little challenging. Israel's, I mean, I can't even begin to deal with kind of its positions with Syria and Lebanon. But I wonder, I mean, in my mind, Israel is this tiny little country surrounded by enemies. That's kind of how I envision Israel. Is that accurate? I mean, what is accurate? What is Israel's position with Syria and Lebanon? That's what I would ask.
Wow, I'm gonna keep that on the table for the moment, Audrey. First of all, I'm not going to be able to answer that in a way that it deserves to be answered. I think, but let's see what other questions there are, and if there's time, I'm certainly willing to hazard something. Lila, and then Nancy.
I was going to answer Audrey's question by saying, what day is it? In a way, there's a flux of, and each. But one of the things that's really interesting is that none of the surrounding Arab nations have offered sanctuary to Palestinians who are behind the border, which is a really weird. I mean, there's so many weird exigencies of history that that would have changed the history of, would have changed Israel as we know it now. As you told this story, I was really struck by all the different pivotal moments there were where these could have gone differently. But what I was really going to say is maybe it's worth telling the story of Brant Rosen and his. I know that and I mean, there are Reconstructionist rabbis and Reconstructionists who are visiting Palestine all the time, and giving testimony to their living conditions, which are really deplorable. And David Shutkin of our congregation does this, and he had a camp that he went to as a teenager that he'd been told it was called Garden something, and he was told that that Jews came to Israel and made a beautiful garden and put agriculture here in what had been nothing. But he found out that in fact it had been Palestinian olive groves there. And this sort of whole narrative of, the Jewish settlers making something beautiful out of something worthless was really a political narrative with a political. So there are rules about the Palestinians. They can't gather in groups of more than 3. It's really kind of draconian. But so I'm not sure I'll get the story right, but but Brant Rosen is a Reconstructionist rabbi in Chicago who left. He came to feel that his pro-Palestinian position was causing strife in his community, some of whom supported where he was and some of whom didn't, and he wanted to be more active, and so he ended up leaving that community and starting a different one. And it's really explicitly pretty anti-Zionist, his new congregation, as far as I know. And correct anything that I may have gotten wrong, Steve. I mean, but that's something that would happen in Reconstructionism that it's hard to imagine happening in any other denomination.
Thank you. Yeah. I just see a couple other hands up. I just want to see if we can get Margaret Cohen. You have your hand up, I think.
Yeah, I have a sticky question.
Okay,
This
go ahead.
comes off the offshoot of the Israel question. What, and I'm intermarried, or maybe I'm not intermarried. Maybe I'm married to a Jew. What do Reconstructionists consider to be a Jew?
Good question.
Okay, great. That's a great question. Yeah, it's so. I can give you the official position of the movement on that
Sure.
question. And then I'll also, Paula, I saw your question too. I'll respond to that. So the official position of the movement is similar to the Reform movement's position on Jewish status, which is that anybody who has one parent who is Jewish, who was raised as a Jew, should be considered fully Jewish. That's the official movement position, and individual congregations and individual rabbis can, come to their own stances on that question. Within Kohalev, we have a bunch of documents that deal with Jewish status, and one of the documents says that anyone who holds themselves out as being Jewish will be welcomed as Jewish within our community. So within Kohalev, we have a very broad range of what people we would consider to be Jewish if they claimed that identity for themselves. Having said that, if there have been cases of people who are members of this community in history where I've said to these people who came from more ambiguous Jewish backgrounds, where I've said to them, you may want to consider going through either a conversion ceremony or an affirmation ceremony, so that if you ever go to a different community that has a less broad definition than Kohalev does, you can comfortably say, I am Jewish according to the movement's definition. So within Kohalev, things are generally pretty, I think, comfortable on that question. But then the question is, beyond the boundaries of Kohalev, there's going to be some diversity. Is that helpful, Margaret?
Yeah, that is. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the question. Paula asked in the chat, I'm sorry, Nancy, I'm sorry. Nancy, go ahead. I totally skipped over you. Yeah.
I was reading in the book, the section about Israel, and I got to a discussion, as I recall, about the very Orthodox. And I can't tell whether I was bringing my own inclination to what I was reading or whether it was there. So let me sort of throw out what I'm referring to. I had the sense that, or maybe it's more of a question, whether Reconstructionism is in any sense attempting to modify the Orthodox dominance in Israeli culture in all the ways that they do. Maybe that's my question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I understand what you were just saying about the assassination changing the tone and perhaps the balance of power.
Mm-hmm.
But this is maybe a slightly different question.
Yeah, no, and that's a relative. Actually, that's a pretty easy question to answer. It's absolutely yes, absolutely, and not only Reconstructionism, but all liberal movements, including the conservative movement, are politically involved with trying to minimize the influence of the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel and bring more equality to non-Orthodox religious leadership there. And because of course if I were to make Aliyah, I would not be able to perform life cycle ceremonies in Israel that would be recognized by the state, because I'm not recognized by the Orthodox rabbinate as a rabbi. So it's interesting that the one time that the American Jewish community as a whole was willing to publicly criticize the Israeli government was a couple of years ago, when there had been this plan to create an egalitarian prayer space on the far end of the Western Wall, that it had been, been months and months in the planning, and everybody had bought in. And then some of the ultra-Orthodox leaders put pressure on Netanyahu, and he pulled out of the agreement and said, well, we're not going to do this. We're going to rethink it, or I don't even remember what he said. But basically, everyone understood that he was being pressured to back out of this agreement that was going to recognize the legitimacy of a liberal approach to Judaism at the Western Wall, which is symbolically a very, significant place. And at that point, there was a chorus of criticism that came in the newspapers, in not just the Jewish newspapers, in all of the regular newspapers in America, leaders of American Jewish movements who were saying, this is terrible, and who does Netanyahu think he is, and this is, we are not going to stand for this, and Netanyahu better be careful, or we're going to stop sending money. I mean, it was all the things that people normally say it's not okay to do. But when it came to the status of non-Orthodox Judaism and that being threatened, in that moment, all of the organizations were aligned with each other and willing even to go public with their criticism.
How long ago was this?
2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I think.
And what would the egalitarian space have permitted that is not permitted now?
Men and women to
Together.
pray together without a mechitza.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess there's one more part to the question, please.
Hmm.
Was there anything historically, maybe this is not possible, but was there anything in what's his name? Stupid.
Kaplan?
Kaplan, thank you. Was there anything in Kaplan's philosophy that would have challenged any of what we see that way?
Oh, very much so.
Did he talk about it or write about it?
That's a good question. I mean, that's another question to look in the diaries about, because he, from the beginning of the state of Israel, the Orthodox rabbinate was given a special amount of power. The way that David Ben-Gurion got the Orthodox community to buy into the creation of the state, is the way that he was envisioning it, was saying, well, I'll let you be in control of the religious issues in the state.
Oh, wow.
And ever since then, it's been an Orthodox prerogative. And, that's a major line of tension between the state of Israel and the American Jewish community. So no, Kaplan would have been very, very much opposed to one sector of the Jewish people having power over other sectors of the Jewish people. I mean, he would have, and because he was so pro-democracy, he would have been one of the people who would probably say, we should have a separation of, quote unquote, church and state, or synagogue and state in Israel, just like we have in the United States. And the religious leaders should not have, political authority granted to them the way they do. So I have no doubt that if he didn't say that, he would have said it if he was given the chance. Lila, I just want to quickly respond to Paula's, and then we can go back. Paula asked about how if there are reconstructionists who support sending money to the Israeli Defense Forces. And my answer to that is, there are some who would and some who wouldn't. I think there are absolutely members of the Reconstructionist world who would say, yes, we have to send money to the IDF. And there are other people who would say, you know what, if I have money to send to Israel, I'm going to send it to institutions that are, promoting democracy and, promoting human rights. And they might say that the IDF does not strike them as being that kind of an institution. So the answer is yes and no. I'm sorry, it's such a, it's a non-answer, but it's a good question. Lila.
I was just going to say, in relation to Nancy's question, that I think the reason that that was such a watershed moment, the Netanyahu's failure to keep his promises to the women of the wall, was that it really raised for the first time the question of whether Israel was a theocracy or a democracy. If if the religious institutions trump the civil institutions, then we can't really call it a democracy. And I think that's, I mean, it's already on the borderline. All the things you can't do, things that are civil in the United States, like marriage, and that you can't do in Israel without. It was Mordecai Kaplan that every Jew is a Jew in the current world. That every Jew is a Jew by choice. Was that a Mordecai Kaplan thing?
It might be. It's definitely a Reconstructionist thing.
Okay,
but it might be a Mordecai Kaplan quote.
I was going to say in Audrey's earlier questions about that any American Jews have it's very easy not to choose to own your Jewish identity at all, so that every Jew who thinks of themselves and participates in Jewish life in that way has chosen to be Jewish in a way that deserves recognition or acknowledgement.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great point, Lila.
Nancy has her hand up.
Nancy,
thank you. The other thing I wonder about then is, was there any recognition of the impact? There's apparently so many Israelis who simply do not practice Judaism because the only way is Orthodox. That's what I've heard anyway. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, that's true, but it's also an exaggeration. And part of it has to do with, this whole Ashkenazic Middle Eastern Jewish split. Because among Ashkenazic Jews who came to Israel early on in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, they really did identify for the most part as totally secular. Again, for reasons that we talked about, their resolution to the problem of Jewish identity was a national resolution that didn't need the religious aspect because they had the national aspect. So it's like, why bother with the religious stuff? Because we've solved the problem. I'm Jewish by nationality, and I speak Hebrew, and I live in a land where the calendar goes by my people's historical, calendar. And so even if I don't go to synagogue, I'm going to get, thank you, Chip. Yeah. Have a good rest of the day. Bye. Even if I don't go to synagogue, my days off in the year are going to be determined by the Jewish calendar, not by the Christian calendar or by the Gregorian calendar. It's like, I'm going to get Passover off. I'm going to get Sukkot off. I'm going to get Shavuot off. Those are the national holidays. And, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So it wasn't necessary?
So being religious wasn't necessary?
So being religious, right. But then when the Middle Eastern Jews came in, they didn't have this kind of radical sense of needing to choose between modern and religious. Like they were, and I think the Middle Eastern Jewish communities, just in general, seem like they were wound less tightly religiously than the Ashkenazic communities were. And I don't know, this is just a pet theory of mine based on things that I've learned about Middle Eastern Jews. But, in the Ashkenazic community on Shabbat, thanks, Steve. Have a good rest of the day. On Shabbat in the Ashkenazic Jewish community, it would be kind of looked askance at if you went out and played a sport in the afternoon after shul, like it's, you should be learning, should be with your family, blah, blah, blah. In the Middle Eastern Jewish community, everybody goes out to the soccer field on Shabbat afternoon and plays together, adults and children. So it's in the Middle Eastern Jewish community, what you have for Passover is a much, you can eat much more broadly than you can in the Ashkenazic community starts off narrow. And in the Hasidic Ashkenazic community, just about the only thing you can eat on Pesach is potatoes, because everything else might be chametz. And you have to be, really, really strict about it. So So anyway, so the Middle Eastern Jews were they were much easier and open to the religious stuff. So in Israel, there's this whole community of people that call themselves traditional. You know, it used to be in Israel, they would say you have two choices. You're either Chiloni, which is secular, or you're Dati, which is Orthodox. And there was like nothing in between those two things.
And others.
And as the Middle Eastern Jews became more prominent, now there's something they call traditional, which is, you know, when they do religious stuff, it tends to be pretty traditional, but they don't feel obligated to do everything. So a traditional family might they might act in a lot of ways like conservative Jews do in America. You know, like they might keep kosher in their homes, but they might eat out at restaurants that don't necessarily have a hechsher. Or, you know, they might have Shabbos dinner and light candles and say blessings over challah and wine, but maybe the next day they're going to go to the beach. You know, and it's a, you know, they just have an easier relationship with the whole system. Having said that, there's really, you know, there's a growing but still very, very small sense of a liberal religious Israeli community. People either who identify, thanks, Margaret, have a good rest of the day. People who either identify as reform or conservative or reconstructionist. So people who have imported these kind of American Judaisms to Israel, and there's that. Or there also, this is more interesting to me, there are people who identify as secular Israelis who more and more are taking up activities that look religious, even though they're secular. So there are secular Israeli groups that have Kabbalat Shabbat services on the beach in Tel Aviv, you know, and they don't necessarily use the traditional prayers that you would find in the prayer book, but they call it Kabbalat Shabbat, and they do songs and they do poetry. And what they're doing is they're reconstructing religious Judaism, you know, for their own time. Or there are places in Israel that are like a yeshiva, where it's like an intensive text study opportunity, but they are secular. So they study Talmud, or they study Midrash, or they study Tanakh, but they don't bring any assumptions, you know, ideologically about where the text has to come from or what it has to mean. So there's some homegrown reconstructionism going on in Israel. Not that they, sorry?
Very interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that what Pardes would be considered?
No, I wouldn't call Pardes quite that. I think Pardes is more of a, Pardes, and I see Happy has her hand up too. Pardes is a progressive yeshiva that in many ways draws its energy from a traditional yeshiva model, but it's egalitarian, which makes it different. And they welcome people bringing in kind of Western academic and intellectual categories of inquiry. And that also makes them different from other yeshivot. But there are other places, like there's a place called Binah in Tel Aviv that is a truly, I mean, a lot of the people at Pardes a lot of the teachers identify as modern Orthodox, not all of them, or as religious in one way or the other. But at Binah, I think they have a lot of actually people, teachers, professors, faculty who identify as secular, but who are in love with the activity of text study and appreciate being able to delve into, you know, this resource, this cultural resource of like the Talmud, for example. So yeah, good question. All right, Happy, you're gonna get the last question of the day here, I think.
My last question does not involve Israel. It involves Recon 101. I discovered in my old copy of this book that you referred to chapter 7 as having a section about prayer. And Nancy shared her version, which was very, very interesting to me. So for those members of this Recon 101 group, the section on prayer in chapter 7 is short. And I was just wondering if you could scan it and send it out, because there are a lot of people in this group who are also part of the prayer inquiry group.
Yeah.
And I just found that section to be very helpful.
Yes. I'd be happy to do that for anyone who's interested. Yeah, I could just send it to the whole group and just say that it was suggested by somebody that people might find this interesting. And,
Yeah.
it doesn't appear in the original
No.
version. Okay.
Oh,
There's nothing there about it. And I really liked what they had to say. You know, as far as my opinion of this book, some of the passages that they have are so carefully worded that I say, wow, that is beautifully worded. And it promptly goes in one ear and out the other. I absolutely cannot remember it. So, you know, I'm glad we had the course, and thank you very much.
Oh, it's been a
Yes.
total pleasure. I just think this is a great group, and it's been really interesting for me to have a chance to have this conversation with you guys. And I don't think we've ever had as robust. We've had some good Recon 101s in the past, but this is like by far, I think, just the best. And we've never done 4 sessions, actually. So I thank all of you for sticking with it. And I just, it was a terrific, terrific experience for me. And
Thank you for putting in the time and the planning and for the time. We just appreciate it.
And thank you for the
was
fourth
special.
session, because Israel is such a complicated.
Thorny question.
Yeah, I think it's great to have an opportunity to hear about the history and just,
Mhm.
I just appreciate the fact that you added the fourth session.
oh, well, thanks, Audrey. We should probably do like a legitimate adult education course on the history of
Mhm.
Israel and Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And, you know, we have done that in the past. It's been a long time since we actually did that. And, you know,
I think you could do it again.
we could. It's just right. We just have to claim the space for it. So, well, I hope people are going to get a chance to go outside a little bit today. It looks
Yes,
like it's a beautiful day. I'm going to
Now
try to
it's
grab a
up.
quick walk.
Yep, exactly.
And
It's supposed to be so warm.
yeah, it's like, and it feels like just as February is ending, it's kind of nice. It's like maybe the lamb missed it by a day, you know. It's like it's so all right.
Thank you.
All right, have a
Thank
good rest of the
you.
day, everybody.
Thank you,
Okay,
Emma.
see you
Bye.
soon. Bye.
Good to see
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.